So let's talk a little bit more about the plant-based diet. So our plant-based diet's effective in preventing type 2 diabetes. Well, we have a few studies that have looked at this, and this is the Adventist Health Study. This is the Adventist Health Study 2, and I actually have a little laser pointer now, but you can see here that non-vegetarians, it's a 7.6% of them had type 2 diabetes in this particular cohort. Now, what's really interesting here is that these folks are all health-conscious individuals. They exercise the same amount, they drink the same amount of alcohol, smoke the same amount, so they're conscious about their diets. They eat fairly, high levels of fruits and vegetables compared to the general population, and they die at about half the rates of the general population. So 7.6%, this is what I wanted to show you here. In the general population, 12 to 14% of Americans have diabetes. And this is the real shocker. 37 to 38% have prediabetes. And this is, of course, adults, which means 49 to 52% of American adults have either type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. It is absolutely shocking. And it's scary because diabetes often leads to heart disease and amputations and diabetes and so on, and blindness and kidney failure and so forth. So 6.1% of semi-vegetarians, 4.8% of pesco-vegetarians, 3.2% of lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and only 2.9% of vegans with type 2 diabetes. So you can see the huge difference. So then they followed the people that didn't have diabetes to see who would develop diabetes. And compared to non-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians had 38% lower risk, and vegans had 62% lower risk of developing the disease. Now, this study I discovered this morning. I was absolutely stunned that I hadn't seen it before. I thought my eyes were failing me as I was looking at it about 6 o'clock this morning. And Epic Oxford, I've been waiting for years for Epic Oxford to release findings about diabetes. And, well, they finally have. Compared to similar health-conscious meat eaters, the risk of developing diabetes was 53% lower among fish eaters. That's people who are vegetarian plus fish. And it was only 37% lower among vegetarians and vegans combined. They didn't separate the vegetarians and vegans. So this was a real shock to me. I did a double take when I looked at it because it's not reflective of the other studies we've seen. So why would people eating fish have lower risk? Well, perhaps the vegetarians are eating a little more of this stuff. That's my guess. They're eating more refined carbohydrates in this particular cohort. I don't know that. It's a wild guess. So I want to shift a little bit to tell you about the results of the work that I've done in the Marshall Islands. And so the Marshall Islands, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, are right here in this little red circle, about 2,300 miles southwest of Hawaii, and sort of between Hawaii and Australia, in the middle of the Pacific, with nothing anywhere close to them for thousands of miles in any direction. They are 82 degrees at pretty much every 100 feet below the surface of the water. At every part of the year, it's a very tropical climate. And in the Marshall Islands, diabetes is a state of emergency. The Marshallese have among the highest prevalence of diabetes and the highest death rates from diabetes globally. So they're always in the top 3, it seems to be, in terms of diabetes rates. In 2019, the rates among adults were 33.8%. I don't know the rates of prediabetes, but I would guess that either diabetes or prediabetes would probably be close to 80%. Half of all the surgeries on the islands are amputations due to diabetes. Also, there's no dialysis in the Marshall Islands. If your kidneys start to fail, if you're rich enough to go to Hawaii, you can get dialysis. If not, you die, and most people just die. So it's just absolutely, just gut-wrenching. It's so sad. 80 years ago, diabetes was pretty much non-existent in the Marshall Islands. People were slim, they were physically active, and they lived off the land. So what did they eat? Well, they ate whatever they could gather or catch. So they obviously caught fish and gathered probably seaweeds, and there were, it's a coral reef, so there's not a lot of good soil, but plenty of coconuts, breadfruit, bananas, green leaves, and something called pandanus. You see this fruit down here? Whoops, I pressed the wrong thing down here. This is a fruit that you just suck the juice out of. You can't eat it. It's too hard and fibrous to actually eat, but it's a really important source of some of the phytochemicals and carotenoids. So how have the diets changed? Why all the diabetes now? Well, the little girl on the left, she was eating this at about 6:30 in the morning on her way to school. A bottle of Pepsi and a popsicle. There's no concept of nutrition. People think if they have a full belly, they're well nourished. Lunch and dinner are white rice and meat of some sort, Spam or barbecued chicken or something like that. The meal over here that you see, this is a meal from a funeral. It would be a birthday meal. It would be any sort of celebration meal, but this one was at a funeral, and you can see chicken, rice, white bread and ham, white donut, white soda biscuits. And then on the bottom left, this was a birthday party for a 1-year-old. These bins are all processed meat. This is luau. Its number one ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. These are all the parts of the animals we don't want, like turkey tails, which are mostly fat, and they're cheap. And the children's favorite snack is ramen noodles with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top. Ramen noodles are cheap, and I can remember once seeing a child eating this, and they were sprinkling white powder on their noodles, and I said to the Marshallese person next to me, "What are they sprinkling on their ramen noodles?" And they said, "Oh, that's Ajinomoto. Ajinomoto is pure MSG." So ramen noodles, Kool-Aid powder, and MSG. And as you can imagine, a dietitian couldn't design a diet to induce diabetes more efficiently than the diet the Marshallese people have adopted. It is the saddest thing in the world. These are cheap foods, readily available, fairly non-perishable. And there are too many people on the island, on the main island right now, to be self-sufficient using island food. They can't. They have to import food. We went into the Marshall Islands, and I mentioned the Diabetes by Design, to do some research to see if we could get this epidemic turned around. And we went in and we had 5 overlapping cohorts. We had a control group and an intervention group, and everybody that ended up in the control was allowed to be part of the intervention after they were a control so that they could experience the benefits as well. And I can tell you, within a week or two, what happened to individuals who started to receive healthy food and daily exercise just blew my mind. I would have never believed it could happen that quickly. People that couldn't walk across a room for 10 or 20 years were walking without pain. People that said their brain had been foggy for 10 or 15 years, all of a sudden they said, it's like my brain cleared out. Just pain that they had experienced in their arms and so forth. It was disappearing so quickly. And you know, this diet in the Marshall Islands, maybe 5 grams of fiber a day if they're lucky, 5 or 6 or 7. Of course, our diet was a little higher than that. And the changes, they were starting to go to the bathroom every day. And many of them were going to the bathroom once a week or once every 2 weeks. And it scared them. They thought there was something wrong with them when they were starting to go every day. So it was very, very interesting. And so the lifestyle treatment program, they were with us for 4 weekdays, for about 6 hours a day at least, for weeks 1, 2, 4, and 6. For weeks 3, 5, 7, and 8, they were with us in the evening for 5 hours, and 9 to 12, they had a weekly evening session. And I'm going to zip through this because I don't want to take too much time with them. But we did cooking classes. We did shopping tours. We taught them how to garden. We brought in earth boxes. We planted gardens in every corner of the hospital grounds that we could. We taught them to grow sprouts. We did daily exercise classes. We got them walking. And if you do nothing else in terms of exercise, for a person with diabetes, walking after meals is powerful medicine. It's unbelievable the change it makes in people. And so we did, after every meal, walking. We did education sessions on everything: food and nutrition, gardening, exercise, stress management, dental health, eyes and feet, all of that stuff. This man was one of the hospital doctors, and they called him the butcher. And he was called the butcher because he was the surgeon that did the amputations. And he himself, as you can see, is a pretty healthy specimen. He just happened to be a vegetarian. And he would come to our program to tell people that the last thing on earth he wanted to do was amputations. He said, I would do anything to save your limbs, but when you come to me after, your wounds have turned into gangrene and your leg is dead, he said, the only thing I can do to save your life is to cut your leg off. So he was trying to help them understand that process. And so I'll tell you a little bit about our results. We saw fasting sugars drop about 71 points on average in the first 2 weeks. By 12 weeks, people were eating more of their own food, and it was about 48 points. But we saw, by 12 weeks, a reduction in A1C of almost 2 points. And CRP came down about 1.2 points. So our results were really quite good. So what about the effort since? This was in 2006 that we did this. We lost our funding. Of course, we had a limited funding. So we've shifted away from research to community action. And we've created partnerships with the Ministry of Health and the Republic of the Marshall Island government. You can see there I'm there with the president and several other dignitaries speaking to children on World Diabetes Day. We created a wellness restaurant to sustain the wellness center. We had to bring in funds, and so the restaurant has become really popular in the Marshall Islands, and we have wonderful staff working there. We do free lifestyle interventions for people in the Marshall Islands, free exercise classes, and I do go back periodically to lead interventions. And in 2014 in Majuro, we averaged, I'm getting better at it, we averaged fasting glucose drop in 2 weeks of almost 120 points. In Ebi, it was about 50 points. And Ebi is a tiny little island. I think it's 0.14 of a square mile and 15,000 people. It's unbelievable. There is almost no produce on that island. In 2016, we did an intervention for people from Bikini Island, where the atomic bomb testing was done after the Second World War. And in this group, we got fasting glucose drops on average of 63 milligrams per deciliter. But we had 11 participants who had drops of over 100 milligrams per deciliter. And this young man came in kicking and screaming. He did not want to be there. But his parents, his mother was a former Secretary of Health who completely reversed her diabetes on this program. She was in our first intervention. And he and his dad came together, and they became the biggest advocates of the program. He did so well. He had a blood glucose drop that was well over 100 milligrams per deciliter. And then in 2017, I went in, spent about a month there with a very dear friend, a speech pathologist. And we created a nutrition education curriculum for kindergarten to grade 6 for the public schools and trained every teacher in the Marshall Islands. So trying to start with the children. You know, these people in the Marshall Islands are really pioneers of the Pacific. The participants of these programs have provided the Marshallese hope amid a very deep sense of hopelessness. And that sense of hopelessness has been exacerbated by what's happening in terms of climate change. They will be the first place to go. And it is absolutely devastating. It's the only home they've ever known. So you can look up the Marshall Islands and some of the reports that have been done. It's very, very sad. But these folks have proved that diabetes can be defeated. We saw several people completely reverse their disease, but can be defeated with healthy food and exercise. They succeed despite poor quality of produce, lack of resources. They're very poor. They persevere amid mountains of spam, ramen, fried chicken, and sticky rice in a very socially engaged culture. They manage with very few gyms and no walking trails. They've started, you know, when we first got to the Marshall Islands, people didn't walk at all. They would be embarrassed to walk because it was a proof that they couldn't afford a 25-cent cab ride. Now they have walks in the mornings and walkathons that get hundreds of people involved. So things really have changed. And people often ask me, do you think this type of program could work at home? And my answer is very simple. If there is hope in the Marshall Islands, given the barriers that they face, of course there's hope at home. It should be a breeze for us by comparison. But of course, the hope rests on demand from those affected, integration of lifestyle medicine into our healthcare systems. It's got to be offered as a treatment option for people. And that's my hope, that it will be in fairly shortly. So what makes plant-based diets so effective? Well, whole food plant-based diets put a lid on the drivers of insulin resistance: inflammation, oxidative stress, lipotoxicity, and dysbiosis. And we'll talk about all 4 of those. So how does inflammation drive insulin resistance? Well, inflammation is caused by excess body fat, especially visceral fat, which promotes the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And the inflammation that results from that interferes with insulin signaling, increasing insulin resistance. And if you look at plant-based eaters, we had a meta-analysis in 2016 that showed that people eating plant-based have reduced inflammatory profiles, reduction in CRP, and this was, 29 studies. And looking at 100% plant-based or vegan diets, we had 2 studies, one from Brazil in 2017. The CRP levels in vegans averaged 0.5 milligrams per liter, compared to lacto-ovo-vegetarians at 0.8 and omnivores at 1.1. And the second study was from the United States in 2007, and this was fairly high raw vegans, looking at CRP levels, and it was 0.52 in the vegans. And in endurance athletes, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened, it was 0.75. And so 0.75 in the endurance athletes who were omnivores, not vegetarians. And then people eating Western diet, it was 2.61. And so quite a lot higher than the omnivores in Brazil, probably because the diet is so much worse in the United States. Oxidative stress is the second driver. Oxidative stress damages proteins, DNA, cell membranes. It promotes insulin resistance, beta cell damage, impaired glucose tolerance, and it promotes the complications of diabetes. So there's a definite advantage for people eating plant-based. Studies very consistently demonstrate that people eating plant-based diets have more favorable antioxidant status than omnivores, and that's probably because they eat more antioxidants and they eat fewer pro-oxidants. And so you can see a number of studies quoted there. Lipotoxicity is one that you may not be as familiar with. And lipotoxicity is very simply the accumulation of fats in non-adipose tissue. So we have this remarkable tissue to store limitless amounts of fat, and it's called adipose tissue, our fat tissue. And so sometimes when too much is coming in for our body to deal with it, we can't send it to adipose tissue fast enough. What ends up happening is fat gets stored in our vital organs, the liver, the heart, the pancreas, and also in our muscle tissue as intramyocellular lipids. And this causes cell damage or cell death in some cases, tissue inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and insulin resistance. And it elevates triglycerides as well, and blood glucose. So what causes lipotoxicity? Well, it's caused by overconsumption of food, leading to overweight and obesity. Diets that are high in fat, saturated fat, and or trans fatty acids are particularly problematic. And diets that are high in refined carbohydrates, especially sugars, also contribute to lipotoxicity. And we know there's an advantage for plant-based eaters. So people eating 100% plant-based have the lowest rates of overweight and obesity of all dietary patterns. They have lower levels of lipids in our muscles, so intramyocellular lipids, which are a marker of toxicity, than matched omnivores. They have the lowest intakes of saturated fat of all dietary patterns as well. And then the fourth driver of insulin resistance is called dysbiosis. And dysbiosis is really just an unhealthy gut flora. And so dysbiosis has been linked with obesity, inflammation, and insulin resistance, all leading to the development of type 2 diabetes. And the key mechanisms of action are that dysbiosis increases gut permeability, allowing things that shouldn't get into the bloodstream in, and that can cause inflammation. Increased production of cytokines, which are these inflammatory compounds. And it can cause metabolic endotoxemia because the gram-negative bacteria that die release these endotoxins that can get into the system and increase insulin resistance. So what causes dysbiosis? Well, unhealthy Western-style diets are a huge driving factor. Refined carbohydrates, processed foods, high meat, high-fat diets, low-fiber diets, alcohol, chemical contaminants in the food supply can all contribute to dysbiosis. Antibiotics, medications, stress, and poor dental hygiene are all important contributing factors to an unhealthy gut microbiome. So again, we see a plant-based advantage, and we have a couple of studies. A study from Brazil looking at about 268 participants, and vegans in this study had the most favorable microbiota, followed by lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And the conclusions of the author were that exposure to animal foods may favor an intestinal environment, which could trigger systemic inflammation and insulin resistance. In the second study from Italy, they found, it was a smaller study, but lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegan diets resulted in a more favorable microflora than omnivorous diets, but the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet was even more favorable than the vegan diet in this particular case. So what we know is the most effective dietary patterns minimize pathogenic dietary components or harmful components and maximize protective dietary components. And if we think about the factors in the diet that are most protective, we think of things like fiber and phytochemicals and plant enzymes and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds and plant sterols and stanols and pre and probiotics And macronutrients when they come from healthy sources with all of the above, and micronutrients the same with all of the above. And when you look at that list, something that just stands out or even leaps out off the page at you is that every single one of these in particular comes either exclusively or predominantly from plant foods. Fiber comes only from plants. Phytochemicals, only plants. Plant enzymes, only plants that can help convert phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolites or their active forms. And anti-inflammatory compounds, mostly plants. Plant sterols and stanols, only plants. You get the picture. This is where the stuff in food that protects us is concentrated. And then if we think about the pathogenic factors, the trans fatty acids, excessive saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, excessive sodium, chemical contaminants, products of high temperature cooking, pro-oxidants, new 5GC, TMAO, endotoxins. If you look at this list, it is 2 categories of foods. Then, and the World Health Organization named those 2 categories of foods back in 1990. The categories of foods that are most profoundly contributing to disease risk are processed foods and animal products. And so again, if you look at this list, trans fats are predominantly, well, they used to be predominantly in processed foods. Now they've been taken out of processed foods. You get them predominantly in animal products. But animal products, processed foods, chemical contaminants tend to move up the food chain, so a lot in animal foods. Products of high temperature cooking, fried foods, processed foods, pro-oxidant like heme iron in meat. New 5GC is a pro-inflammatory molecule in meat. Endotoxins from the gram-negative bacteria, dead bacteria, and that's mainly in ground meat. You just get the picture. And the picture is that most of what people eat in North America is a threat to health. And fortunately, we have a choice as human beings about what we put in our mouth. There is no doctor or dietitian that can eat for you. We want probably, this is a really optional for depending on your caloric needs. But for most people, 2 or more servings of whole grains or starchy vegetables. And these are the foods that you adjust based on your energy needs. So once you've consumed the 10 servings or more of veggies and fruits, and the 3 serving of legumes, and your 1 serving or 2 of nuts and seeds, and all of those things, then you add in these more energy-dense foods to make up for, or to get to where you need to be in terms of your caloric needs. Whole grains, we know, can lower diabetes risk, particularly relative to refined grains. There was a 2018 study that reported for every half-ounce serving of whole grains, diabetes risk was reduced by 11% for men and 7% for women. And what about potatoes? Well, there was a 2016 meta-analysis of 5 studies showing no association or decreased risk with potato intake. 2 studies that showed increased risk, but 3 out of 3 studies showing French fries increased risk. No big surprise there. So the practical pointers here, we want people to be selecting colorful starchy vegetables, prepared without added fat, selecting the lower GI options, and selecting mostly intact whole grains, because all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar does not equal a bowl of old-fashioned oatmeal, and a box of kamut flakes does not equal a kamut berry salad. The reality is, even once you've eliminated all refined grains, you're not eating any white flour, white rice, or any of the products made with that stuff. You're just eating whole grains, stone ground, whole wheat, whatever. there is still a hierarchy within that group of whole grains. And at the top of the hierarchy, the best of the best are intact whole grains, pretty much as they're picked off the plant without, you're not adding anything that damages health. You're not taking away anything that is of benefit to health. And so you're eating them as they are with everything there. And make them, if you want to make them even one step better, sprout them and watch the vitamin C increase and the anti-nutrients decrease and things, get more absorbable and so forth. So that's something you can do. Next would be cut whole grains. All you've done is cut them, like steel cut oats, for example, and bulgur. Then would be the rolled whole grains like rolled oats. And then the shredded whole grains like shredded wheat. And then the ground whole grains like whole wheat flour products. And then the flaked whole grains like flaked cereals. And at the bottom of the barrel, you've got puffed whole grains like brown rice cakes or puffed brown rice. So these are still whole grains, but they're puffed. So why are we, saying they're getting worse and worse? Well, as you go down this list, you're increasing the surface area of the grain and making it more absorbable. It is more quickly absorbed. And so you're increasing the glycemic impact, but also you're reducing the nutritional value because the amount of processing required is increased. Okay, so you're exposing that grain to air and light and all of those things. And so you want to stay, if you have diabetes, fairly close to the top of that list with more of the intact grains. So unprocessed, intact, sprouted grains, or plain starchy vegetables like yams. Minimally processed would be cut or rolled or shredded grains or frozen or mashed starchy vegetables. Moderately processed would be like flaked or puffed whole grains or whole grain flour products, starchy vegetables with added fat and salt. And you want to completely avoid highly processed whole grains like refined grains or whole grain snack foods with added fat, sugar, and salt. Nuts and seeds, one serving a day or more for some people if you can afford more calories. But this is where a lot of your essential fatty acids reside. Now, nuts, we don't have a lot of studies on seeds, but there's a study on nuts showing that when fully adjusted, diabetes risk was cut in half for those consuming 4 or more servings of nuts a week, compared to those consuming less than 1. Practical pointers, and we do have studies on seeds as well, especially chia and flax seeds, showing some reduction as well. One of the very interesting thing about nuts and seeds is they all offer something a little different. And so I think it's important to have variety. So for example, chia, flax, and hemp seeds and walnuts are our key sources of omega-3s. Almonds and sunflower seeds are the highest in vitamin E. Almonds, chia seeds, poppy, and sesame seeds are loaded with calcium. Iron is highest in cashews and seeds, and you get the idea. So as you go down the list, even hazelnuts are highest in manganese, and Brazil nuts in selenium, and so forth. So having the variety is really wonderful. But you need to keep portions moderate, because nuts have about 600 to 800 calories per cup. And so you don't want to be eating them by the bowlful. What I do is I keep a nice bowl of nuts in the shell on my kitchen counter. And so if I want nuts, I have a walnut. I have 1 or 2 at most. And so that, to me, it helps you limit your intake when you're eating them from the shell. And I also, one of the things I do is I keep a mix of seeds, chia, flax, hemp, pumpkin, in a container together with chopped Brazil nuts. And that goes on my breakfast bowl. So I get that variety and I get the selenium thrown in there as well. I keep it in a mason jar in the freezer. So again, you're wanting unprocessed or minimally processed choices. Nuts or seeds in the shell, raw or shelled nuts or seeds, soaked or sprouted nuts or seeds. Minimally processed, like dry roasted. Moderately processed would be those with a little bit of added oil or salt. nut seed butters with added salt, for example, and highly processed are the nuts and seeds that are coated in sugar or chocolate. So we need to avoid those. And herbs and spices are the one group that people forget about. And we should not, because they have more phytochemicals and antioxidant per gram than any other food. They're just loaded. So you want to be having, including them at every meal if you can. And we have a number of studies showing that herbs and spices help fight diabetes, and particularly things like cumin and turmeric and ginger and garlic. So a lot of evidence there. And the practical pointers are just to incorporate them at every meal, even breakfast. You can put allspice, you can put cinnamon. If you're doing I sometimes do a little Indian lentil dish for breakfast, and then you can put turmeric and cumin and all of those things in. But add them at every meal. You can drink spice or herb-infused teas, add fresh herbs to salads. There are lots of ways of getting them in. Essential ingredient number 7. I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but I have only 7 minutes and 23 seconds left. So a healthy gut microbiome. Dysbiosis, as we mentioned, fuels insulin resistance and diabetes. So how do we improve gut flora? By eating more prebiotics. Where do you get prebiotics? From the fiber in plant foods. Things like, Jerusalem artichokes and onions and garlic and all sorts of grains and other fruits and vegetables and all of these foods, beans, they all provide prebiotics, food for bacteria. We can eat food-based probiotics. So prebiotics are the food for bacteria. Probiotics are the bacteria themselves. So we can do cultured and fermented foods. We need to minimize our intake of foods that are associated with dysbiosis. Highly processed foods, fried foods, artificial sweeteners, which I didn't get to talk about much, but they can actually cause dysbiosis, and meat. So we don't want those things. We want to, I did have it there, avoid artificial sweeteners. Avoid excessive alcohol consumption. Essential ingredient number 8 is a low glycemic load. We want to replace high GI foods with low GI foods because it improves glycemic control, reduces inflammation, and reduces risk of heart disease. So how do we reduce it? By emphasizing non-starchy vegetables and legumes, by controlling our serving sizes of starchy vegetables and legumes, and by selecting lower GI foods within each category. So sweet potatoes instead of white potatoes, intact rather than ground grains. And we want to include foods known to reduce the glycemic impact of meals, like legumes, higher fat foods like nuts and seeds and avocados, acidic foods like lemon or lime juice or vinegar. They actually reduce the glycemic impact of the food we're eating. And some spices like cinnamon can help to reduce the glycemic impact. Essential ingredient number 9 is to load up on anti-inflammatory, phytochemical, and antioxidant-rich foods. And what we know is these foods can help to reduce diabetes risk. So we want to emphasize colorful vegetables and fruits, herbs and spices, legumes, nuts, seeds, whole grains, sprouted foods, fermented foods, and even certain types of tea like green tea. How do you do that? Think color. The richest sources of phytochemicals are often the most colorful. So purple instead of white onions, maybe black or red instead of brown rice, or black or red quinoa instead of white, dark instead of light greens. We want to include a lot of variety. We want to choose organic because it's higher in phytochemicals and antioxidants than conventional sources. We want to eat more raw foods because some of the enzymes they contain help to convert phytochemicals into their active forms, especially with cruciferous vegetables and allium vegetables. We want to eat sprouts because when we sprout foods, we magnify the phytochemical content. It's often increased 5 to 50 times. We want to pile on the herbs and spices. Drink the antioxidant-rich teas, add the fermented foods. An essential ingredient number 10 is low dietary contaminants. So environmental contaminants and products of high-temperature cooking is what we're talking about. These can do a lot of damage. They can cause oxidative stress, fuel inflammation, disrupt hormones and become obesogenic, damage our organs and damage DNA in the central nervous system. That all increases risk of diabetes and its complications. We're talking about pesticides in conventional produce, heavy metals like mercury in fish and arsenic in rice, and persistent organic pollutants in fish and meat and dairy products. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to, again, choose organic when we can, eat lower on the food chain, and vary our grains. Arsenic can injure beta cells, and so we need to limit or at least carefully select our rice. And if we eat it, cook it in a large amount of water because we can get rid of a lot of the arsenic that way. Products of high temperature cooking, like heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and acrylamide and advanced glycation end products. The heterocyclic amines are only found in animal products, but polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and acrylamide can be found in anything. Well, acrylamide's more in potato products because of the asparagine there, which gets converted to acrylamide. So all of these things we need to reduce, and the solution is to avoid charred or blackened foods, especially meat, poultry, and fish. Avoid fried foods. Use moist cooking methods more often where you're using water or broth. Essential ingredient number 11 is to moderate sodium, and very few people with diabetes meet the target. The upper limit recommended for those with diabetes is 1,500 milligrams, and only 2.4% of people with diabetes meet that recommendation. And those with the highest versus lowest quartile of sodium had over double the risk of heart disease and over 10 times the risk if their A1C was over 9. That's scary. 75 to 80% of our sodium comes from processed foods. And if you look at the amount of sodium food, a teaspoon of salt has 2,300 milligrams. Ramen noodles, pickles, vegetable soup, tomato sauce, veggie burgers, Italian dressing, whole wheat bread. You can eat an ounce of potato chips and an ounce of salted peanuts and get less salt than what you would get from 2 slices of bread. Is this shocking? It's because when you coat a food with salt, you taste it. But when you put it throughout the whole batter, you don't. So you need to read labels. And finally, essential ingredient number 12 is adequate micronutrient intakes. People with diabetes often have micronutrient deficiencies, so choosing nutrient-dense foods helps to ensure adequate nutrients when calories are limited. And so nutrient density becomes very important, and the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet are green leafy vegetables and other non-starchy vegetables and fruit. Legumes and starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds are all good choices. The lowest nutrient density of all foods, oil and sugar. Nutrients of concern on plant-based diet, B12 and vitamin D. And B12 is important because for people on metformin, it can really reduce the absorption. So I've got 30 seconds. The take-home message is every time you eat or drink, you either feed disease or you fight disease. Whole food plant-based diets are very powerful medicine for people with type 2 diabetes. And in my opinion, it is time that healthcare systems offered lifestyle treatment programs as the first line of therapy for lifestyle-induced diseases like type 2 diabetes. And it is high time that they offered food services that promote health rather than undermine it. And these are my 2 new books on diabetes, which provide much more detail than what I went into in this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.